Good morning. I'm Delegate Marcia Price, and I represent the 95th District, which has parts of Newport News and Hampton, and thank you for joining us this morning. In 2021, Virginia will redraw our political district lines, and that process happens once every 10 years, so it is important that we get it right. A part of getting it right is making sure that every voter has a voice in our democracy. That's why I am committed to redistricting reform this year, so that voters can choose their elected officials and not the other way around. Last year marked the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans being brought to our shores. It also marked the 400th anniversary of this legislative body. Those two events are forever inextricably linked, and in these 4 centuries, this legislative body has accomplished some amazing things. But those achievements are tangled with systemic oppression and marginalization of Black Virginians. The intentional exclusion of Black voters from our democratic process has been one of the most demonstrative reminders of this past. And so it is the intricate history that I described that must be the starting point for tackling redistricting reform. Simply put, there is no reform without the full and equal inclusion of communities of color. This morning, I am presenting to the public House Bill 1256, which is proposed legislation to create an independent redistricting commission and to ensure that every voter in Virginia has a fair and equal voice in choosing their representatives. It is critical to have an independent commission in place for the 2021 redistricting process. Under the bill, the Commonwealth would create an 11-member commission, including 4 appointments from both political parties and 3 non-affiliated members. The commission will be tasked with drafting redistricting plans for the House of Delegates, State Senate, and Congress, and holding hearings on those plans. The commission structure created in House Bill 1256 would insulate the process from having a single political party unilaterally vetoing maps and deadlocking the process. And it would ensure voters have a role in defining their own communities of interest and weighing in on the proposed plans with public input. Further, House Bill 1256 provides that the commission will be representative as a whole of the geographic, racial, and gender diversity of the Commonwealth. It must also be noted that for far too long, the conversation on redistricting reform has focused solely on the who to the exclusion of the how. But the practice in how we draw the lines and the rules that must be followed are important pieces to these equations. House Bill 1256 includes proactive, affirmative protections for communities of color in the map drawing process. The past few years have shown us it is important to respect and protect the voices of Black communities. Twice, district lines drawn by this legislature were invalidated by the courts as racially discriminatory. The district I represent has its new configuration because it was redrawn by a special master to rectify the fact that this legislature packed Black voters into a district which diluted their voice and the weight of their vote. And at this point, at a time when the Voting Rights Act has been systematically gutted at the federal level, we can't just reference it in the legislation that we enact today. House Bill 1256 provides specifically and explicitly for communities of color and communities of interest to have a real say in this process. Lastly, House Bill 1256 prioritizes public input and transparency in the redistricting process, providing ample opportunity for voters to define their own communities for map drawers. And in this bill, we have purposefully accelerated the timeline for the commission to make sure there is enough time for the public to weigh in on maps before they have to be finalized for the 2021 elections. So today, I am presenting House Bill 1256 as a legislative solution to redistricting reform, for the 2021 process as we work toward better, more inclusive language for a constitutional amendment to guide future processes. I'm thrilled to be joined today with fierce voting rights advocates who will tell you about their support for this approach to redistricting. But in closing, I want to be very clear. In order for all communities to thrive, we all have to have an equal say in the decisions that affect our lives. At a time when we are actively removing language from our code that is based in the ugly history of suppression, we must not then add back in problematic language that does not ensure all voters are respected equally. The legislature has an opportunity with House Bill 1256 to move forward boldly with redistricting reform that proactively addresses 400 years of discrimination to make sure communities of color have an equal opportunity and voice in our democracy. Redistricting reform must happen this year, and it must be in a way that leaves out no voter, no matter where they live or the color of their skin. Thank you. And we will take questions of them.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Yuri Rudensky, and I'm Redistricting Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. It's a pleasure to be here. Redistricting reform has long been central to the Brennan Center's mission and our work with advocates, lawmakers, and community groups around the country. We believe that the redistricting process should be more independent, community-driven, transparent, and compromise-oriented. Our views are informed by studying redistricting. We have examined how each state draws its districts, what has worked to produce fair maps, and conversely, what has deprived communities of fair representation. This decade, Virginia's is a cautionary tale. All three maps passed by the legislature after the 2010 census were thrown out as unconstitutional racial gerrymanders. It took years, millions of dollars, and numerous court orders to fix these discriminatory districts. That is the status quo, and put simply, the current process in Virginia is both untenable and unacceptable. And so the question isn't whether reform is necessary, but what the right path forward is. The constitutional amendment that passed last session laid the groundwork for what is possible and represents a step in the right direction. It is certainly an improvement over the current state of affairs, and I do not want to disparage that effort. But the framework in House Bill 1256 offers some enhancements in important areas that track what we strongly believe are best practices. These should be carefully considered because they follow tested methods and would go even further in making map drawing fair to all Virginia voters and communities. Key among these enhancements are a structure and voting rules that promote independence and cross-party collaboration. The 11-member commission, as outlined by Delegate Price, would have 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 3 unaffiliated members. Importantly, current lawmakers, lobbyists, and other individuals with conflicts of interest would be precluded from serving. And the voting rules for passing a map, which require support of 7 out of 11 commissioners, would encourage the collaboration across the political spectrum. The commission would also convene with enough time to conduct extensive hearings around the state, giving the public an active role in defining districts. All of the commission's work and deliberations would be subject to strong disclosure and transparency rules so that both citizens and lawmakers can have confidence that the process has been executed as designed. And last but not least, the commission would be bound by clear mapping criteria focused on preventing coherent communities from being split, and that would ban the twin evils of racial and partisan gerrymandering. These are exactly the sort of ingredients that the Brennan Center looks for in fair redistricting process. It has been encouraging to see redistricting reform take root in Virginia, and the Brennan Center welcomes the day that gerrymandering in the Old Dominion is relegated to the dustbin of history. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Kaya Nguyen. I am the co-executive director of New Virginia Majority. We are a statewide civic engagement organization that has been organizing and encouraging voter participation among voters of color and underrepresented communities throughout the Commonwealth. We were founded on the premise that more of us need to be engaged and more of us need to have a seat at the table. especially on decisions that impact our lives. And if we're going to make real progress for our communities, whether in the areas of education or healthcare or criminal justice reform, we need to make sure that that real progress is not hindered by systemic barriers, and how our districts are drawn are fundamental to that. In the 2010 redistricting cycle, our organization participated as best we could. We drew alternative maps and presented that at various committee hearings. But that process was not open and transparent, and there wasn't structures for communities to really engage in how their alternatives presented. So when the lawsuits happened and the maps were challenged, we filed amicus briefs and put on the record our position around making sure that Black voters in particular that were drawn and packed into districts and their votes were diluted did not have that impact. The last several months, we have gone throughout the Commonwealth into communities and asked them, what would they like to see in a fair map? How would they define their community of interest? There's a lot of talk about that, but if you don't go directly into the community to have them give you input on what they view as their community, then how are we actually drawing these maps in a fair way? So what we're encouraged about, in particular about HB 1256, is that it is very intentional about that public input and that process, and making sure that there's transparency throughout the map-making process to make sure that our voters and our constituents and our community leaders have a fair say in their representation. So we firmly believe that redistricting reform needs to happen in this state. We firmly believe that it needs to happen now in time for 2021. And it's really important that we get this right to make sure that we aren't faced with more lawsuits over the next several years. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Garrett Arwa. I represent All in the Line, a national advocacy program of the National Redistricting Action Fund. We're here to speak about the need for redistricting reform in Virginia, one of the most badly gerrymandered states after the 2011 process. The people of Virginia need real reform that creates a truly independent process. We believe Delegate Price's bill is the best and most viable path to ensuring an independent redistricting process in 2021. There are two provisions of this bill that I would like to echo that we fully support. Number one, we believe reform should not give one party the ability, be they Democrats or Republicans, to block the process from moving forward. We have a problem with any reform that gives too much power to partisan actors and allows them to derail the process for the benefit of one party. Second, we believe reform must ensure that communities of interest and communities of color have the ability to have their voice heard and to fully participate in the process. A reform like this allows for redistricting to start this fall, which gives plenty of time for an independent commission and the people of the Commonwealth to have public hearings and make sure that they have full input into the process. Oftentimes, the worst maps come from a deeply flawed process where communities of color are excluded, there is not transparency, and there's not robust public input. Again, we stand here in support of Delegate Price's efforts to push strong, independent redistricting reform in the Commonwealth as the best and most viable path forward. We urge all members of the General Assembly who support reform to support Delegate Price's effort and move the state into an era where it has independent redistricting, where voters get to pick their politicians and not the other way around.
Thank you, and I'll take some questions. Hometown advantage. Great.
Thank you. So I'm reading this bill, and it's my understanding that this is an advisory commission. It's not binding. So any map or plan that the commission gives to the General Assembly is subject to change. Can you address that?
Yeah, so it does allow, so you're absolutely right. This does not change the Constitution. So the drawing of the maps would be voted on within the General Assembly. But there are limited ways that we could change them. And so it's for the commission to give us a map and for us to vote on it. I think the true fail-safe to make sure that there's a map that gets voted on by this General Assembly is up to the public. This is not the time for you to stop the pressure, the emails, or the phone calls for those of you that want reform. It would be an opportunity for the public to have even more input, letting the legislators know that you fully expect for us to pass a fair map.
What's wrong with the?
Sorry, behind you. She was-
Just wanted to clarify, is it an up or down vote by the legislature, or they be free to amend it?
So it could go through the amendment process, but it is a majority vote to pass.
Proposed constitutional amendment passed with pretty broad bipartisan support last year. What is the biggest hang-up that it could be blocked by one party in the Supreme Court? Is that your biggest hang-up with it?
So I don't know that I have prioritized my full list of complaints about the proposed constitutional amendment, but if you will remember that month when that came, the compromise came out of the conference committee, quite a few of us stood up and voiced these concerns. What I do think has changed is the ability for the majority party to ensure those that we represent, that even with a legislative fix, we are going to go back and have a constitutional amendment next year, but it would be better language. So it would be even better reform than what we voted on last year. And I think that is what the 12 or so of us that were voting against it in the House really wanted. We wanted to make sure that the diversity of the commission was in the language. We wanted to make sure that the drawing process of the maps that would protect communities of color and communities of interest are in the amendment. And so there has been talk about making the amendment better with enabling legislation. But as a full human being standing before you, a Black woman, I would want to see that my protections are written into the explicit language of the amendment.
Because there seems, some lawmakers have said their top priority is ensuring that there are African Americans in the legislature, and there's a concern that diluting the African American vote could lower the number of African American lawmakers in the legislature. Is that
I definitely honor that philosophy in years past. But I do believe in this last election, we have shown with some of the members of the Black Caucus representing majority Caucasian districts, that is no longer what should be the main priority for us. We have gotten to 23 members, with 11 of the districts that were struck down being redrawn and additional districts that were surrounding them being redrawn. We got to 23 members. And so I think that it is now up for us not to protect my specific power here in the legislature, but that of the African American and communities of color, the voters, and that's where the focus should be.
I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. Do you envision this being approved alongside the second vote of the amendment and having two commissions?
No, as I stated, this is a legislative proposal that I would like to put forward and have passed so that it would guarantee that the process for 2021 has rules and a commission in place while we work on better amendment language for it and another amendment to be passed in 2021, which would then guide the future processes.
21 and 22, right?
I'm sorry.
It would be
Yes,
21
the
and
2021 process. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what preserving communities of interest actually looks like on a map? How that,
Sure, so I can use the 95th district. With all due respect to how it was drawn prior to the special master being involved, you could look and think that the African Americans that live along Mercury and those that live in the zip code 23607 and those that live in Farmington were all the same. And if those words don't mean anything to you, they also didn't mean to the drawers because they don't know my community. There are third-generation college graduates that live within Farmington, and within 23607, there are families that are struggling to make $19,000 for a yearly income. So there are factors within geographical areas that even if the voters all look alike, there are things that separate their interests and how they would vote, or what they would say, or even who their candidate of choice would be. And so you have to ask the people that live there, what is their community and help them define it, as opposed to people who are in closed doors, behind closed doors, drawing it for political advantage.
And can you also just sort of speak to the enabling legislation that Senator Lucas and Locke are sponsoring that they say addresses some of the concerns around the amendment?
Yeah, I think I answered that in the fact that the concerns that I have with civil rights protections and voting for voters of color need to be in the actual amendment. And so I do think that the enabling legislation may address some of my concerns, but why, as a Black woman, should I not be protected by the same Constitution that you would be protected by? Was there another hand?
So if the General Assembly just really doesn't like whatever the commission comes up with, can the legislature just scrap the commission's proposal and start from scratch?
So there would be 3 tries. And again, I would say that there's public input and transparency in this process. So I believe that they would get to at least one of the 3 that could pass the majority. And I know that having newly experienced walking into a majority myself, there is more of a responsibility for us to get to good governance. And so I think that there is a lot of public pressure for us to get to these reforms, much like it would be for us to get to a good map. But it would be a better map because the process got us to a better product where we have nonpartisan conversations, but also public input. One last question. Yes, in the back.
Is this essentially an anti-gerrymandering, committee that basically tries to keep, the lines being drawn for one way or another? I mean, you talk about protections for minorities, but what are they being protected from, if you could kind of spell that out?
Yeah, so in the past, there have been congressional districts, and like we just had 11 House districts that were struck down because of the way that they were surgically drawn to precision to pack African Americans into the districts, which dilutes African American voters' voices and the weight of their votes. So this would prevent that because it also includes within the legislation the rules by which they would have to draw the maps, and there are several outlined rules that would prevent political and racial gerrymandering. So if I was not clear, if there's nothing else you leave with today, I would like to end racial and political gerrymandering and get to fair community-based maps. Thank you all so much for coming.